In a small but cozy town lived four friends: John, Mike, Emily, and Sarah. They had been inseparable since childhood and often spent evenings together, sharing scary stories. As they grew older, their meetings became less frequent, but their passion for horror remained. One chilly autumn evening, when thick fog enveloped the streets, the friends gathered at John's house to spend the night talking and reminiscing. But none of them could have imagined that this evening would turn into a real nightmare. After dinner, they settled in the cozy living room with hot tea and sweets. It started to rain outside, and the sound of raindrops on the roof created the perfect background for their traditional stories. Mike, always eager to take the lead, suggested that everyone share their scariest story. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and everyone began recalling the creepiest tales they had heard or made up themselves. John was the first to begin. He told a story about a ghost supposedly haunting an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The legend said that this ghost was the spirit of a young man who had died under mysterious circumstances, and that anyone who dared enter the house would never come out alive. The story was frightening, but to John's disappointment, his friends didn't seem scared. They had heard similar stories many times before, and were now waiting for something truly terrifying. Next was Emily. She told a tale about a woman who would walk the streets at night, crying under the windows of houses where someone had recently died. It was said that if anyone heard her cry and looked out the window, they would die within a few days. The story was eerie, but since it was well known in the town, none of the friends took it too seriously. They dismissed it as just another urban legend. Then it was Sarah's turn. Her story was about a strange phone call received by a girl. The voice on the other end of the line told her that she would die in 3 days if she didn't follow specific instructions. The girl didn't believe it and ignored the warning. Exactly 3 days later, she was found dead in her apartment, and her phone's last message read, "You didn't listen." This story sent chills down the friends' spines, but they still laughed it off as just another campfire tale. Finally, it was Mike's turn. He was always the most creative and resourceful of the group, so expectations were high. He started by telling them about an old ritual that, according to him, had been known since ancient times. The ritual involved gathering a group of people and telling the scariest story they could imagine. But the catch was that the story had to be so frightening that it would come to life and become reality. The friends listened to Mike with bated breath, feeling a chill run down their spines. He continued, explaining that those who dared to perform this ritual had to do it at a specific time, midnight, and only in complete darkness, except for candlelight. He added that if anyone in the group became so scared that their heart couldn't take it, the spirits summoned by the story would take their soul forever. The friends began to feel a slight unease, but being skeptics, they assumed that Mike was just trying to scare them. They decided it was a great opportunity to test the truth of his story. Mike, seeing their willingness, suggested they try performing the ritual right then, as midnight was approaching. Everyone agreed, though with some hesitation, but no one wanted to be seen as a coward. Mike turned off the lights, leaving only a few candles on the table. The room was immediately filled with a sinister atmosphere. The shadows from the candles began to play strangely on the walls, creating bizarre and frightening shapes. The friends started to realize that the game they had begun might not be as harmless as it had initially seemed. John was the first to tell his story. He described a terrifying incident when, late at night on a deserted road, he encountered a strange man. The man was completely wrapped in a black cloak, and as John drove past him, his car suddenly stalled. The strange man approached the car window and looked inside. His face was distorted, and his eyes burned with a red fire. John felt a shiver run down his spine and realized that this man was not of the living world. The friends sat in silence, listening intently. The feeling of fear gradually intensified. They sensed that the game was beginning to spiral out of control, but no one wanted to back down. John's story ended with him miraculously starting the car and speeding away, but the strange man continued to follow him in the rearview mirror until he returned home. Next was Emily. She began to tell how she once got lost in the woods during a hike. The forest was dense and gloomy, with trees standing so close together that they almost blocked out the light. Suddenly, she heard a strange whisper coming from the depths of the forest. She tried to find her way back, but the whisper grew louder, and soon she saw something that defied explanation: figures, seemingly made of darkness itself. began to emerge from behind the trees and move toward her. Emily recounted her story with a trembling voice but continued despite the fear she felt. The figures moved closer, and she realized that if they reached her, she would never return from that forest. Fortunately, she found a path and ran to a clearing where the strange beings disappeared. But the fear she experienced stayed with her forever. Sarah, trying not to show her fear, went next. She told of strange events that had happened to her family several years ago. Her grandfather, known for his stern demeanor, had once brought home an old, battered suitcase that he found in the attic. Inside the suitcase were several ancient items and photographs of unknown people with eerie expressions. After the suitcase appeared in the house, strange things began happening. People started seeing shadows, hearing whispers, and her grandfather became increasingly withdrawn and morose. One night when Sarah was home alone, she heard someone walking around the house, even though everyone was away. Leaving her room, she saw a figure standing by the suitcase and realized it was her grandfather. But his face was unrecognizable. It was distorted like the faces in the old photographs. She screamed and lost consciousness. When her parents returned, the suitcase was gone, and her grandfather was found dead in his room. The tension in the room grew with each story. The friends felt that with every new tale, their fear was intensifying. No one wanted to be next, but the game continued. Mike, sensing it was time to finish, began his story. He said that the story he was about to tell would be the scariest because it wasn't made up. It had happened to a friend of his. He began to describe how his friend had once met an old man who offered him to play a game. If the friend won, the old man would grant any wish he desired, but if he lost, his soul would belong to the old man forever. The friend, thinking it was just a silly joke, agreed. The game started with simple questions, but with each new question, they became more complex and frightening. In the end, the friend lost. The old man merely smirked and said, "You made your choice." After that, his friend began to have strange dreams in which the old man took his soul. He would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling as though death was following him. A week later, he was found dead in his bed with an expression of terror on his face. Mike finished his story, and the room fell silent. Everyone felt a deep sense of fear growing in their hearts. At that moment, the candles suddenly went out, and the room was plunged into complete darkness. The friends began to panic, not understanding what was happening. John tried to light a lighter, but it wouldn't work. Emily screamed, feeling cold hands on her neck, but when the others rushed to her, there was no one there. Their fear reached its peak when faint whispers began to emerge from the darkness, as if someone was telling them stories they did not want to hear. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. Everyone froze, unable to move. The knock came again, and the door began to slowly open. A figure shrouded in darkness appeared in the doorway. The friends couldn't believe their eyes. It was the old man Mike had described. He slowly entered the room, his eyes gleaming with malice and hatred. He approached each of them, whispering in their ears, and each friend felt cold hands gripping their hearts. No one could move. Fear paralyzed them, leaving no chance for escape. The old man waved his hand, and the whispers grew louder, turning into screams of terror. The darkness began to fill the room, consuming each of them. Their bodies began to disappear, as if dissolving into the air. Mike was the last to hear the old man's whisper. "You made your choice." At that moment, he realized that the story he had told had become their reality. The next morning, the house was empty. No signs, no traces of struggle, just empty cups on the table and a few burned-down candles. No one ever knew what happened that night. Soon, the house was declared cursed, and no one dared enter it again. The town moved on, but sometimes at night, people heard strange whispers coming from that house. Whispers of those who once decided to tell the scariest story and vanished forever.